I'm pleased to introduce Emmanuel Thorne and Anita and Noel Epstein to Politics and Prose today. Thorne is the son of Rabbi Leon Thorne, the author of the 1961 memoir of Out of the Ashes, the story of a survivor. It Will Yet Be Heard is a compilation of Dr. Thorne's original memoir and his previously unpublished accounts of his post-war experiences in Poland and Germany. Rachel Brenner, professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, writes, Leon Thorne has given us an important Holocaust memoir. Never sentimental or self-pitying, Rabbi Thorne writes as both a victim and a witness. Thorne's vivid account of the terrifying odyssey from devastated Poland to the American zone shines light on this little-known chapter in the history of Jewish survivors. Anita Epstein is one of only 0.5% of Jewish children to survive the Holocaust. In her memoir, Miracle Child, Epstein recounts her wartime experience, her miraculous reunion with her mother, and her later life in the U.S. Stuart Eisenstadt, former negotiator of Holocaust compensation, writes, as witnesses to the Holocaust inevitably dwindle, Anita Epstein's moving memoir about the worst of humanity and the best becomes more vital to read, especially for the young. Epstein is joined today by her husband and co-author, Noel Epstein. Now please join me in welcoming Emmanuel Thorne and Anita and Noel Epstein.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming out today. I'd like to thank Politics and Prose for hosting this event, and for Anita and Kate and Jonathan Woolley for conceiving of this talk. I'm delighted to share the podium with the Epsteins. As I've discovered in their book, we've crossed paths many times. Once, I think, in Krakow when we were babies. There's some photography to support that. But one thing I'm sure of, we were both undergraduates at Brooklyn College at the same time. We didn't know each other then, I don't think. But I think after the talk, we're going to look into this. So I look forward to the presentation of their remarkable book. Before I talk in depth about my father's book, let me tell you a bit about him. He was born in Krakow in 1906 he was born in Galicia in 1906 when Galicia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Galicia became part of Poland after World War I, when Poland became independent, and is today the Ukraine. My father came from a Hasidic family, and he received his smicha, that is his rabbinic ordination, from the Polish Hasidic rabbis when he was 19 years old. Only then did he pursue his secular education in Germany. He earned a doctorate in history and philosophy at the University of Würzburg and a modern ordination at the Jewish Theological Seminary of Breslau. I mention this background to note the wide range of knowledge, perspective, and training that he brought to the writing of this book. Now, as you all know, in September 1939, Germany attacked Poland from the west, and the Soviet Union a few weeks later attacked Poland from the east. In June of 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union and invaded my father's part of the world, wreaking destruction. And during the next years, my father was a prisoner. His immediate family of his wife, his father, elderly father, and his sister were murdered, as was a large part of his extensive family. Communities, friends, towns were destroyed. He describes all this in the book. After numerous near-miraculous escapes, in mid-1943, he found a hiding place in a cellar with 4 other Jews. My father wrote the first part of the book. There are 2 parts. The first part of the book while he was in that cellar, and he was in that cellar for 53 weeks. In his opening chapter, The Cellar, my father writes that his purpose in writing the book is, quote, to put down everything I've experienced, witnessed, and been told about the Nazi crimes against my people. He continues, quote, the despairing cries of my fellow Jews in the ghettos and death camps never leave my consciousness. This conviction that their cries must not go unheard is one way to understand the title of his book, It Will Yet Be Heard. My father goes on, 5 of us are hiding out in the cellar, under a stable situated on the premises of an oil well in Schodnica, a Galician town in the Carpathian Mountains. I am here with my younger brother David. Dr. Isidore Friedman, a successful lawyer before the war, is the 3rd male member of our small group. The 2 women here are Louisa Mahler, recently made a widow by the Nazis, and my young cousin, Stella Backenrath. The cellar is 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 5 feet high. We cannot stand upright, although we can stretch out when lying down. I write while lying on my cot, leaning on a bucket of water, which is covered by a thick piece of cardboard. This is my desk. And now, in the name of God, I begin to write. So begins his book. Well, as my presence here and my sister Ziva's presence here attest, my father survived. My sister Ziva is right there. My father's brother, David, who was in the cellar with him, also survived. His daughter, Nurit, is here. Raise your hand, Nurit. And my father's cousin, Stella Backenrath, survived. And here's her son, my cousin, Leon. Where are you, Leon? My father and the others emerged from their coffin-like cellar in September 1944 upon their liberation by the Soviet Army. My father believed that he and the other Jews in the cellar were the last Jews alive. Indeed, that may explain why he wrote the manuscript in German rather than in Yiddish, which was his first language. After emerging from the cellar, my father enlisted in a Polish army that had retreated to the Soviet Union. Within that Polish army were Jewish units, and he joined the army as a rabbi chaplain with the rank of captain. Parenthetically, there are 2 wonderful pictures in the book. One of my father's father in full Hasidic garb, including a fur shtreimel, and another of my father in a commanding and formal pose in his captain's army uniform. This is a chassid. In the second part of the book, my father describes his post-liberation experience, including his entry into Germany with the Polish army. A memorable image from the book is his description of arriving in a newly liberated town and his driver blowing his shofar in the town center, and the startled, unbelieving Jews emerging from their hideouts. He also writes in part 2 of the attempts to reconstitute Jewish life in communist Poland, where many of the government leaders were secular communist international Jews.
Could you speak a little louder?
Sure, sorry. Should I start from the beginning? Yes, he also writes in part 2 of the attempts to reconstitute Jewish life in communist Poland, where many of the government leaders were secular communist internationalist Jews with mixed feelings regarding the Jewish survivors. This book is a history not written by one of the victors, but by one of the losers. It is a memoir written by a religious man who is also a trained historian. He recounts the events of the war as one who is at once caught in the sweep of the unfolding history and witnessing the events with an historian's observing perspective. He is in the canvas, but he also sees the canvas that he's in. And he is writing in German to a future he imagines is devoid of Jews. My father's purpose in his stories is to reveal by his story what other people are enduring. I will read his story of the banker from Bruin, one of the people whose cry my father wished should be heard. He is writing about Yom Kippur, 1944. Remember, he was liberated in August of 1944, so shortly thereafter, the Jews tried to constitute a synagogue in time for Yom Kippur service. He writes, I rose in my synagogue on Yom Kippur to recite the Mourner's Kaddish in memory of a man I saw only twice in my life. I do not know much about him. I never even learned his name. But I came to consider the story that he told me and the request he made of me only hours before his death as a last will and testament that he desperately wanted me to carry out. I met him in the fall of 1942 at the Yanova labor camp, where more than 300,000 Jews would perish before the war was over. When I was there, the camp had 12,000 inmates, whereas the accommodations had been designed for barely 5,000. The barracks was so jammed with humanity, there was no room to sit, much less to stretch out on the floor. As a result, many of the inmates, including myself, preferred to spend the nights outdoors even when the weather was cold, as it was on that damp and chilly night 3 days after Rosh Hashanah. I felt one of my fellow inmates huddle close to me in the dark for whatever heat my emaciated body had to offer. I think we've lost this. No? Each person has his own way of reacting when he feels he has reached the end of the road. I wanted nothing more than to be left alone, to sit without moving, and to let my mind go blank. But the man beside me appeared to be driven by a compulsion to talk, regardless of whether or not anyone else would listen. Speaking in a faultless German with the merest trace of a Czech accent, he told me his story. Before the war, he had lived in Brno today, a large city in Czechoslovakia, where he had owned a bank and much property. Along with countless other Jews, he had been deported by the Nazis to Poland. It all seems very strange to him, for until that time, he had not been much of a Jew at all. In fact, he had despised his Judaism and had been convinced that the sooner the Jews forgot their Jewishness, the better it would be for everyone. Accordingly, he had his 2 daughters baptized in the Catholic faith when they were born. For some reason he never explained to me, he and his wife had not formally converted, but they had accompanied their children to church every Sunday and stayed with them throughout the service. I must say that at first I scarcely listened to the man's account. I did not even turn my head in his direction. What was the sense of this confession? What was there to talk about? By this time, I told myself, not only his wife, but even his children, little Jews whom all the baptismal water in the world could never have turned into Aryans, had probably been killed. Before long, he too would be dead. And how much time did I have myself? Surely there was never a time when talking made less sense than on that cold autumn night when everything seemed about to come to an end. But then, as if he had been able to read my thoughts, the former banker from Bruin began to explain why he felt the need to tell someone the story of his life. He was aware of the fate that lay in store for him. Now, before he was killed by the Nazi murderers, he wanted to atone for the sins he felt he had committed against his religion and his people. He would be able to do that in this place. How could he do that in this place and at this time? Why, it was all very simple. He would draw up a last will and testament. He was a lawyer, he told me, so he should certainly know how to do that properly. Since he had no one left in the world, this will would leave his entire estate to the Jewish community in Palestine. True, the Nazis had taken his property, but he was convinced that eventually they would lose the war and the money that could be realized from his houses and chateaus in Czechoslovakia would come in very handy when the war survivors rebuilt the homeland of the Jewish people in Palestine. This way, he would atone for his past indifference to the fate of his people and for his former violent opposition to Zionism. Then, too, his will would include a clause to the effect that on one day each year, someone should stand up in the synagogue and recite the mourner's Kaddish for him, for his wife, and his 2 children. The fact that his children had been baptized at birth made no difference, he said. In his will, he would declare them posthumous converts to the Jewish faith. Surely such an act would be in accordance with Jewish law. After all, despite their baptism, his 2 daughters had been murdered because they had been Jews. He fell silent for a few minutes. It seemed to me that he was weeping quietly. Then he began to speak again with increased intensity. In order to make his will, he said, he needed only 2 things. First, a piece of paper on which to write it, and second, a person to whom he could entrust the document. He already had a pencil, he told me, holding up a stub so tiny I could hardly see it between his thumb and index finger. He proposed to name the World Zionist Organization as his executor. They would surely know how to dispose of his assets in the best interests of the Jewish people. But to whom can you give your will? To keep until the war is over and it can be sent to the World Zionist Organization, I asked. How do you know that any Jew in this place will still be alive then? I will give it to you for safekeeping, the banker replied without another moment's thought. If and when the time comes that you are about to die, you will turn it over to someone else whom you consider honest and reliable, with instructions that when he feels that it's his time has come, he too will turn it over to someone who is likely to outlive him. Look, I know that I can't last much longer. Even if they don't kill me, I will die in a few days. I am at the end of my strength. Now, if I could find some paper, write out my will, and hand it over to you, I would be able to die in peace." I turned to him, and for the first time saw his face by the light of a weak bulb outside the barracks. He looked not much older than 40, but his long, thin face was a mask of agony. I promised to do as he wished. He asked me my name, I told him, and at the same time assured him that he was not necessarily at the end of his endurance, that within ourselves we have secret reservoirs of strength that we are not even aware of until we need to draw upon them. Nevertheless, I said I would do my best to find a scrap of paper for his last will and testament when I went out on my labor detail the next morning. When we parted before dawn for roll call, we agreed to meet again at the same place. I would surely have the paper for him. As fate willed it, we were not able to keep our rendezvous. Several days later, early in the morning, our battalion passed through the gate of the camp on the way to an outside work assignment. Suddenly, I heard a voice calling my name. I turned around. It came from somewhere behind the fence near the gate, the place where they kept the inmates who were to be shot that morning, after the others had gone out on the labor details. There I saw him again, the banker from Bruin. Our eyes met, and he gestured with his hand as if he wanted to write. "Remember," he shouted to me through the fence, "paper for the will." The guard beside me shoved me forward. As I moved away, I could still hear the banker behind me crying mournfully, "Kaddish, Kaddish, remember Thorne." Excuse me. "Say Kaddish for my children." My father said Kaddish for the banker from Bruin and his children, and since my father's death, I say Kaddish for the banker from Bruin and his children. I hope my children will continue this tradition. Isaac Bashevis Singer reviewed an earlier version of the book, and in that review he said, "It is painful to read such a book, but it also possesses a power of catharsis. Such books allow us to experience the truth without theories and without easy solutions." So I'd like to close with the book's dedication. The book is dedicated in deep humility to those heroic martyrs who perished in the European ghettos and concentration camps because they were Jews and because they lived Jewish lives. They died as the world looked passively on. May this book serve to remind mankind of what happened to them, and may they know in heaven that they are remembered. Their stories told, their experiences recalled, and their heroism extolled. Thank you.
This is my wife Anita's book, so I don't want her to be off on the side while I'm talking for her. She can't. I've had the honor of having Anita as my wife and as my mentor on a lot of things. And she has been speaking with me over the years about her life, and I have made notes for years, and we finally sat down to write it, and happily. Why did we do that? We were getting old. And she's worried a great deal about what's going to happen after the last generation is gone. She is clearly one of the youngest or younger survivors of the Holocaust in the world. She was born in November of 1942 in Krakow, Poland, 3 years after Hitler had conquered Poland. She was born in secret in a hospital in the ghetto at night with shade down and one light on in the room, her mother told her, and was hidden. And when the Krakow ghetto was liquidated, her parents took Anita in a bag, like a bowling bag, a leather bag, and her father slipped away, got a cab, and took her to a prearranged place where they had she was hidden throughout the rest of the war. Miraculously, her mother, who survived 4 camps, her father died in Mauthausen, her first father. Her mother survived Plaszow, which was the camp you saw in Schindler's List, right outside Krakow. Actually, it's part of Krakow. And Auschwitz and Thuringen, and then finally Bergen-Belsen, where she was liberated in 1945, May, by the British. And despite the fact that she, like the others at Bergen-Belsen, had contracted typhus and was put in the hospital after the war by the British. They created a hospital there out of former barracks for the Germans. She wanted to go back to Krakow to find out if Anita was still alive. She knew that her parents, grandparents, and 3 of her 5 sisters had been murdered, or 4 actually. And she didn't know if Anita was the only family member left. Her grandparents were murdered, her parents, almost her entire family was murdered. And so she and a friend, who was also in Bergen-Belsen and getting well, got permission from the doctor, who said they were both too weak, really, but they said they wanted to go anyway, to go back to Krakow. Now, that's a trip that took them around 3 weeks. Today, it's a matter of hours from Bergen-Belsen, which is in northwest Germany, to go south, then to go east across Czechoslovakia, Germany and Czechoslovakia, and then finally into Poland. After the war, as many of, I'm sure you all know, there was chaos in Europe, total chaos. Incidentally, I want to do a little correction here. I just remembered. It was said when we were introduced that Anita was one of 0.5% of Jewish children who survived the Nazi era. Actually, she is about 10% of Jewish children survived the Nazi era. But in Poland, where Anita was hidden, that's indeed the case. It was 0.5% who survived, which is why after the war, a number of the adult Polish survivors called her a miracle child. I still think it's a miracle. In any case, back to where we were, her mother and a friend, who was 10 years her junior, somehow managed to get trains. You have to understand that trains were crippled during the war, and people rode on the trains and on the locomotives and out the windows, and, nobody could get seats, and there were so few of them, which is why it took 3 weeks to get there. And nonetheless, her mother and her friend made it, and they got back to Krakow, and they went to where her mother knew her father had left her. She wasn't there. The woman who had hidden her and her family had moved to Katowice, which is about 40 miles west of Krakow. And she did it not to avoid the Nazis. She did it to avoid the Polish nationalists who were killing Jews after the war. In any case, Anita's mother, bless her, got back on a train and found Anita. The woman who, let me try and explain this a little better. When they went to the place where she had been, the woman knew that she was alive, Anita, and where she was. So she gave her the address. And when she went back, Anita was outside with friends, little girl, 2.5. So, and Anita came up and said, I'm your mother. I mean, her mother came up and said to Anita, I'm your mother, and which really upset her. This is the only mother she knew was the Polish woman, and her mother wasn't very happy at the reception. She assumed she'd be welcomed with open arms, but she wasn't. And Anita cried and screamed and said she had been a good girl and she shouldn't be sent away, but she was. After the war, the only place you could resettle, almost the only place you could resettle those days, was back in Germany, in the American zone. So you had to go back to live with your oppressors, because most countries in the world didn't want you. They certainly didn't want Jews, and that certainly includes the United States, which was quite anti-Semitic at the time and did not allow many Jews to come in after the war. In the process of writing this book, Anita and I came across all kinds of things we have no idea about. Maybe you folks did. For example, there was a study done several years ago by the German Foreign Ministry that showed that about 30% of assets and funds looted by the Nazis from the Jews, about that money financed 30% of Hitler's army. Now, I had no idea that the Jewish assets were financing their own destruction, in part, at least. I had no idea that General Patton was such an anti-Semite. You may know that now, but George Patton, he was in charge of the American zone right after the war, and in Germany, and he treated the Jews, quote, like animals. He said they were lower than animals, and I just knew nothing about that. I knew nothing about Anita's first love, who was a German boy. She lived in a house at this point in Selb, Germany, which is on the Czech border. It is noted for its porcelain. It's where Rosenthal and Hutchenreuter were made. And she lived in this house with the German family on the second floor, and she and her mother on the first floor. And one night, her mother was out. She didn't know where she was, and she got scared and zipped up the stairs to Peter's room. This is Peter, her friend. Peter was her friend because he had a rabbit and a cat. Let her play with both of them. So she instantly fell in love with him. And he said, if you're scared, come into bed with me. So she did. She jumped into bed, cuddled up, and he said a little while later that he had to use the bathroom. And she said, don't leave me here alone. So she went with him to the bathroom, saw what he did, and tried to imitate him. Didn't work. She got very wet. And she says in the book, it was not your best introduction to your first time sleeping with a boy. I want to thank all of you for coming here today. I want to thank Politics and Prose for arranging this. I'm very shocked that on an NFL playoff day, we have so many people who are here to listen to this. And that is truly heartening to me, because you know how little is known in the United States about the Holocaust. Last spring, there was a study done by the Conference for Major Jewish Claims that they commissioned, and found that I think it was 43% of Americans didn't even know what Auschwitz was or what it was for. Before that, when we did the book, the only comparable study available had been issued in 2005, sponsored by the American Jewish Committee, as I recall. And at that time, it was more than 50%, about 56% of Americans had no idea what Auschwitz was about. So actually, the latest study is an improvement, which is hard to believe. The final tale I'll talk about is Anita being auditioned to play the part of Anne Frank in the George Stevens film. Her mother had heard that they were scouring the world for someone to play Anne Frank. This was because, incidentally, Audrey Hepburn had been approached by George Stevens and declined the role. Don't ask me why. She read the first time very nervously and thought she had done terribly. But Stevens' assistant, who she read for, asked her if she could come back. She said, "You're kidding? I'll be back." She was, and Stevens was there himself. And he asked her to read and talk to her mother. They were fascinated by her mother's story. But he ended up sending her a thank you, but no thank you note. And he said in that note that it was because she had no experience as an actress. But she couldn't figure that out, because the person he picked for the role, was Millie Perkins in the end, and she was a 19-year-old model from New Jersey she was totally bereft of acting experience, which is what some of the critics sensed when they saw the film. It had to be something else than her experience, and she thought there were possibly two reasons. One was that she had really done a rotten reading, and she was very much inclined toward that explanation until she was called back for a second reading. What she didn't have was the all-American appearance of the non-Jewish Millie Perkins. And her Holocaust story probably would have become part of the publicity surrounding the film. And that actually would have defeated George Stevens' purpose. You have to understand that Stevens viewed the Anne Frank movie as a romantic film, with Anne as a typical teenager rather than a young Jew scheduled to die in the death camps, as his biographer remarks. In notes that Stevens jotted down in his own paperback edition of Anne Frank, he said he looked for an Anne Frank who was neither tragic nor particularly Jewish, a view that coincided with Otto Frank's preferred conception of his daughter, and that depicted the ordinariness of her character in the Pulitzer Prize-winning play on which the film was based. Anne, he said, must be universal, And so Anita said, I suspect that I was penalized, at least in part, for being a Holocaust survivor, for perhaps looking too Jewish, for not appearing universal or American enough. And I will finish how she finishes that episode. In any case, I confess, when the film came out, I was pleased with the New York Times review. It praised the entire cast, except for Millie Perkins. The reviewer regretted as, quote, deeply unfortunate that Millie Perkins does not rise to Joseph Schildkraut's level of spiritual splendor in his role of Anne's father. He called Perkins reedy. I hope that it doesn't seem too mean-spirited of me to note this. Any questions?
Yes.
Where would the
over here?
From? Right here.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
How did you meet?
How did I meet my wife?
Yes.
We met, and it's in the book, in the lobby of a movie theater in Brooklyn on a Friday night when you were looking for, what are you going to do tonight? I don't know. What do you want to do? A Marty kind of thing. She was at the movie with two friends sitting in the balcony, and I was there with two friends in the row in front of them in the balcony. And one of my friends was talking to one of her friends during the whole thing. When the film was over, and incidentally, it was an awful film, but it holds a special place in my heart. It was Return to Peyton Place. And in the book, incidentally, I don't know how this happened. I found a photo from the Brooklyn Historical Society of the marquee of the Avalon Theater in Brooklyn, which is where we met that weekend with that film playing. So it's in the book. That's how we met. It was raining outside. A friend said, would you like us to drive you home? But we were just going to stop for coffee at a restaurant near Brooklyn College where Anita was attending. And he said, fine. And so we squeezed into the car. I got in first in the back. Anita got in second in the back. Another friend got in third in the back, and we were all squeezed together, and that's how we met.
And when did she come here?
Oh, good question. Anita came here in November of 1949 because of the anti-Semitism in this country and the various statutes that were passed in Congress. She couldn't get here until 49, and only then because her father actually had to lie. Her second father. Her mother met in the DP camps in Germany, met another man, a wonderful man, and he had fled when Poland was invaded. He had fled east to the Soviet Union and ended up in the Gulag, in the lumber camp. And when the Soviet Union, when the Germans invaded the Soviets, Stalin needed all the help he could get, and he released all the prisoners and used them in his military. Some went to the Anders army that was referred to earlier, but that was actually a quite anti-Semitic army. And her father ended up being sent to Moscow and was trained as a tank captain, and believe it or not, fought in the largest tank battle in history at Kursk, which is a very famous tank battle. And they were not, after the war, when McCarthyism and anti-Soviet feelings were enormous, they were not going to let in somebody who had been a captain in the Soviet army. And so he lied and said he was in the camps. And actually, he got away with it. They were letting it happen. And that's how he got here and spent years in fear that somebody would find out. You're welcome.
I have a question for Manny. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the process of putting this book together. You mentioned that your father had originally written in German. Are you the one that translated everything from the German or possibly from the Yiddish into English? And also, at what stage in your own life did you become aware of your father's experiences until you had seen what he had written? Did he talk about this to his children? Did you find the writings much later in your life? I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how you encountered, these memoirs.
My father was not one of those who shied away from talking about his experiences. He spoke of them often. I read this text. It was before my bar mitzvah, so maybe I was 11. And so by then, it had been translated into English. It went through a number of translations, one might say. The first translation from the German was probably just to get it translated, not to get it nicely written. And so then it went through editing of that sort to make it literate. And and then he translated it, or he rewrote it, I don't know which, but in Yiddish, into Yiddish. And it was published in the Yiddish newspapers in 1961. It was serialized for a year in their Tag Morgen Journal in the Yiddish. He had a famous editor work on this, a man by the name of Harold Ribeloff, who there's even a literature prize named after Ribeloff. And my father did not like what came out. A number of the stories, the incidents that my father wanted told, Ribeloff had edited them out. If you take a look at the book, you'll see that he mentions a lot of names. And I think there was a view then that mentioning names disturbs the flow of the writing. I don't think it does, but it was thought so then. And so several of the stories that my father wanted to tell, and my father told stories not just for the interest of the stories, but also to bring out the character and to memorialize somebody. For example, the story I read to you today is not in the first book. Ribeloff edited that out. And there are other stories like that. My father then wrote a second part, which begins with his liberation from the cellar, and which tells that story, which is of itself interesting. But then he uses not a very difficult literary device. And the story that you heard today it's taking place after his liberation, but he's remembering what happened before the liberation. That story belongs in book one. So this is all by way of saying there's been a lot of thought to do this. And my father died in 1978. In the midst of the Shiva, we got a call from a writer by the name of Louis Falstein. Most of you haven't heard of him, but he was a terrific writer, and you can look him up. They think that the Catch-22 writer plagiarized him, and anyway, that's Falstein. So Falstein, my father had engaged Falstein to take a look at the book, and so Falstein came in with his suggestions. At that point, Falstein, since you asked the question, I'm sorry for going on and on, but Falstein had access to the Yiddish version. So the version that you're going to see in this book is somewhat different than the original book. This book also has part 2, which is his experiences after his liberation, and that's not in the first book.
This question is for Mr. Epstein, and I'm curious if you know how your wife's mother extracted her from the Polish woman. I mean, did she have, what kind of documentation was it? It was hectic.
Well, okay, that's an interesting question. Before my wife was given to the Polish woman. Her mother and her father had written letters to the Polish woman, and they had given the Polish woman a photo of her mother, which on the back of it said, "This is Anita's real mother." Just in case she didn't survive, she wanted to know what her mother looked like. So the woman recognized her.
So
She had the photo of her.
So
That's how.
It was not proof. She just seated the daughter over.
Oh, yeah. There are a lot of stories that I haven't told you that are in the book, particularly about Anita's life here.
Given that both Manny's father and Anita were surviving in Poland with obviously help from non-Jewish Poles, and it's very controversial nowadays about Polish-Jewish relationships, would either or both of you comment on what you feel the relationship was either during the Holocaust period or perhaps afterwards? I know that Manny, took a trip recently to Poland, but what are your thoughts about Polish-Jewish relationships?
You want to answer?
Yeah. Okay.
I'll answer.
So my father, sorry?
It's hard. Go ahead, say what you want.
And so, really.
Sorry, she has apraxia, which is very difficult getting the words. Do you want me to tell them about Sophia?
You did that.
Okay, I should. Just let me put. I guess my feeling, and answer your question, I'll make it short, is that there's a big difference between some individual Poles and the Polish nation as a whole. Polish nation as a whole has a long history of being anti-Semitic and terrible. There were heroic Polish Catholics during the war. In her case, the woman's name was Sophia Zendla, and she said that her mother, who was very religious, said that she had to take this child, and she did as a result. And Anita has always been amazed by that, even though she was promised some remuneration for it, because her father, Anita's first father, was rather wealthy. It's okay, everything was taken from them, so they didn't have anything to give away after the war. But the woman nonetheless shielded Anita throughout the war and afterwards. So I'm a big fan of hers, but not of Poles in general toward anti-Semitism.
Just to respond, I have a friend here who is with the Polish embassy, and Filip Janiewski, and this must pain him enormously to hear this. Not that it's not true, but it must pain him. So my father was saved. I didn't mention this, but the landlords of the cellar in which he survived were two Polish Catholic families, and they took their lives in their hands. It may not be well known, but if you saved a Jew in Poland, you were killed, your family was killed, everybody in your apartment house was killed, unlike in the West. And they bravely saved my father. I have discussed this with Filip. He says, I think, that there is no Polish Catholic anti-Semitism today, ever since Pope John Paul II. And it is quite remarkable if that's true. How does a culture change with thousands, hundreds of years of anti-Semitism? I'll just tell you a quick story. So it's mid-1943. I'm sorry, Christmas 1943, and the two Polish families, Catholic families who are saving my father, announce that they have something important to propose. And they came down Christmas Eve in their finest clothing and said to them, listen, friends, outside there are no more Jews. All the Jews have been killed. We are your only friends. We have been hiding you from the Germans all these years, but we cannot hide you from Jesus. If Jesus wants you to die, what can we do? These two humane, wonderful Polish Catholic families could believe, based upon what the church had taught them and their history, that the Gestapo were the agents of Jesus, and that by saving Jews, they were sinning. This is a perverse theology. I was in Poland in January, and whoever I met there, I asked, does this make any sense? Is there any history of this? Nobody could explain it.
Thank you.
Good question.
Manny, I had the riveting experience today of being on a train, and I decided to read After Liberation, thinking that your family wound up in DP camps right away. Well, I have to tell you, it was as harrowing, including Manny's birth and survival after the war. I mean, I've never read an account like that, because it's also getting out of Soviet Poland. As a matter of fact, it reminded me of some of the stories we're hearing now about people getting out of the Middle East or Central America. So I really recommend it highly. But on a more personal point of view, as a child of survivor, did you feel it was your responsibility to do the book? How do you feel now and for the next generation? Because I know a lot of us are in that position, and I personally feel the responsibility of doing the films I do, and how it is for you, and and always telling people, do your oral histories, and even if your family have passed away, try to find what the stories are, because that's what is so amazing to me, is that your father always wanted to document as much as possible, including with the banker.
Well,
you
were going to tell a story.
Oh, yeah. Just talk about this one.
okay.
How do you make sure this is on? It's on. Put it close to the mouth.
One she was one. She was and when a youth and
Finished?
yes,
Connect.
yeah.
She wants me to talk about Sophia, who was Zenla, who was a wonderful woman, the one who hit her. And they went back to see her, her and her mother, in, I forget the year, 86, something like that. And there's a photo of them together in the book, her mother, her, and Sophia. And she baptized her actually in the church that became one of the churches of the future Pope Paul. And she had a cross around her neck, and she gave her a different name and false birth certificate and all that. And she was just very good to Anita, right? She was. And she was a great lady. Again, this is a Polish Catholic lady who was just absolutely wonderful. And her daughter is the only surviving member of the family. She had a couple of sons as well and a husband. They've all since passed away. And her daughter, name is Danuta, came to live with us for a year and went back. And Anita has gone back and visited Danuta 2 or 3 times, and you'll see again a photo of Anita with Danuta and our daughters and one of my granddaughters in the book. So it was great. And I wasn't going to tell any other stories. You don't want to hear any more stories. I mean, there are funny stories in the book. The one everybody likes best is when I accidentally almost slipped into bed with my future mother-in-law, which is in the book. Let me tell you, that was a time. Of course, the only word she could think to scream at me was Litvak. She, of course, was Galiciana, like Anita. Yeah. In any case, there are a lot of stories in the book that I have not stopped to tell you. Is that it? Or we got more questions?
Manny has to answer mine.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, thanks for your question, Aviva. I have to distinguish my purpose from my father's purpose. Again, this is not my book. This is his book. He wanted, as the title says, he wanted the voices to be heard. He wanted names to be mentioned. For him, it was like a monument etched in names with the addition. Imagine if you could go over to the Liberty Square Memorial in New York, where everybody who died in 2011, their names are etched in. Imagine you could also see their names and press a button and get their story. That was my father's objective. It was a memoir, certainly. It was a history of Galicia and what happened in the war. And most importantly, he wanted these stories and these names remembered. If you look at the index, you will find names of, he doesn't even know their names. Shimon the Butcher in Krakow. His name's in there. He tells the story. His name is in there. He is memorialized. The banker from Bruin, we don't know his number, his name. He's memorialized. That was my father's purpose. My purpose was much simpler. My purpose was to honor my father and get the book out. Much simpler.
Can you tell us about your father's odyssey after the war?
Repeat the question. My father's odyssey after the war. Where to start? So he was liberated by the Soviets, as I said, in September 1944, and joined the Polish army, and then went to a town called Rzeszów, which is in Poland, and became the rabbi in Rzeszów. This is historically interesting because there was a major pogrom in Rzeszów after the war. It's in all the books on Jan Gross's book, Fear. My father was the rabbi in the town where there was this pogrom. He met my mother, interestingly, there. My mother was from Lithuania, and she had been saved by a Polish Catholic priest, as well as my father had, and she was on her way to Palestine. And there was an underground organization, think of it as an underground railroad, of places to stay and hide while you were traveling, called the Bricha. My father's place in Rzeszów was a Bricha station. So my mother came through. 3 weeks later, they were married. And then he escaped Poland. He saw where things were going. He didn't, living under the Soviets, he didn't want, and he certainly didn't want to live in a Poland that had no Jews. And so he hid. The book tells the stories of how he got out of Poland and went to the American zone of occupation. Very briefly. From there, he went to Frankfurt, where he was a rabbi at the Samson Raphael Hirsch Synagogue in Frankfurt. He came to the United States in 1948 and struggled to make a living. And there were many years of struggle, and he became a moil, a circumcision rabbi, and he continued his rabbinic activities as a moil and other things, rabbinic things.
So this is partly related to your point that your father wanted these things to be memorialized. But you mentioned that you thought your father may have thought no one would be able to speak Yiddish. The Jewish world, in some sense, wouldn't be there afterwards. And that seemed in contrast to the story of the banker, who what was important was that the Jewish world was going to continue, and he would be a part of it. And so I'm wondering, where your sense that your father thought that, so little would survive would come from, and how does that tie in to the name of the book, where it says, it will yet be heard, which, if we think of it from its source in the Bible, doesn't mean just that things will be memorialized, but rather things will change. And all the destruction will yet turn out into a good world. And did your father's view, do you think, shift from when he was taking the notes, in the bunker, to the second half, when he's sort of telling the story when he gets out?
Well, he was filled with despair and hope, and they mixed, and they went from one to the other. In his book, the first book, Out of the Ashes, the cover, the title, subtitled, Out of the Ashes, the Story of a Survivor. What does that tell you? I was in hell, and I came out, and I'm living. Is there anything optimistic about that? Anything hopeful about that? I was in hell, and I'm living. The cover of his book, that was the title. The cover of his book showed a phoenix rising with the 10 Commandments in its mouth. Is that despair? No, that's this title. It will one day be heard. Brides and grooms will still be singing and dancing. We will have celebrations. So I think he felt them both. I think he certainly felt the despair, but he also was very focused on the tradition, the Jewish tradition of renewal and being optimistic. I could tell you more, but that's...
So it's sort of a similar question to the Epsteins, but really to Anita's mother, which was, what was her sense between between despair and hope? Because she worked
her mother?
Yeah, because she worked so hard at making some future be possible for Anita.
Her mother despaired privately and hoped publicly. I think that's the best way to put it. She didn't talk about her despair a lot, though she had nightmares and terrible times thinking about what she went through. But she was a very strong, positive woman outwardly. She was a remarkable woman, her mother, I have to say. She just was. That's about it.
Thanks.
Unfortunately,
that's it.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up, despite the fact that we could go on. We have copies of both of these books available behind our register. Please give a round of applause for our wonderful speakers.